Welcome to our first webinar for Revolutionary Stories, a project of the Freedom's Way National Heritage Area. I'm Patrice Tedisco, the Executive Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. Freedom's Way is one of 55 national heritage areas within the United States. We work in partnership with the National Park Service, and in the broadest sense, it's our mission to promote and enhance the natural, cultural, and historical resources of 45 towns and communities in Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire. So I'm going to turn it over to Desiree Dembski-Hamlin, our Deputy Director, to do an introduction. And I look forward to hearing your questions and conversation at the end of the webinar. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Patrice. In 2021, Freedom's Way embarked on a year-long journey to completely redesign its website with the primary goal of creating an interactive online museum through which to curate the unique nature, culture, and history of the region. With its successful launch earlier this year, we now have the infrastructure in place to share thought-provoking stories about the people, places, and objects that make the heritage area worthy of its national distinction. This, in part, is why we developed Revolutionary Stories, the enduring legacies of the American Revolution in the Freedom's Way National Heritage Area in preparation for the forthcoming 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. Working in collaboration with local partners, such as yourselves, we aim to gather, record, interpret, and share both well-known and underrepresented stories about the people, places, and objects related to the 45 communities that now comprise the heritage area in the periods before, during, and after the Revolutionary War. With funding from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati and the National Park Service, Freedom's Way has dedicated resources to support your research and programmatic initiatives as they relate to this important and exciting theme. Please do not hesitate to reach out should you wish to discuss these opportunities with us further. And that brings us to today's webinar, the first in a three-part series of free informational webinars designed to provide technical assistance on research techniques, as well as practical examples on how to create an interpretive and educational experiences to share stories about the people, places, and events during the American Revolutionary War period. Our presenter and dear friend, Mary Fuhrer, is deeply connected to the heritage area and was instrumental in developing Patriots' Paths and declaring independence then and now, the latter of which was recognized with a Leadership in History Award of Excellence from the American Association for State and Local History in 2019. Today, Mary will provide an overview of resources and strategies for local history research on Freedom's Way towns, land, and inhabitants before 1800, with an emphasis on the Revolutionary War period. There will be ample time for questions following Mary's presentation. However, feel free to use Zoom's Q&A feature to enter your questions as they come to mind. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you in the coming days. And with that, please join me in welcoming Mary Fuhrer.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this. We will be exploring hopefully the sorts of evidence you can use to build your stories about your people or events in your town during the Revolutionary period. And since I have a lot of documentary evidence to share with you, I'm going to jump right into sharing my screen and get us off. So let's see. Here we go. Can everybody see that? I hope good. Okay. Thanks. Okay, sources and stories. So I just want to tell you in advance, I'm going to let loose a sort of fire hose of information about the sources that we can use to build stories about the Revolutionary period from our towns. And I don't want you to have any worries about taking it all in. I've provided an outline that I think Desiree sent ahead with notes that will cover the types of evidence I'm going to be discussing and how they're read and interpreted and where you can find them. Also, as Desiree mentioned, this program is being recorded, so you can return to it later and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So sit back and relax, and here we go. You have perhaps already found a story about a person or a group of people from your town that you want to flesh out so that you can tell fully and vividly. And this can be challenging because most of these stories will be about common folk in your towns. And colonial Massachusetts people didn't have their biographies written in general or write it about themselves. That's from a later, more self-reflective age. So metaphorically and literally, really, if you look at this picture, these people down here on the bottom of the screen in dark, they are also darkly and vaguely rendered in history, in the sources. This is Amos Doolittle's famous print of the Battle of Lexington. And yet these are the people who made the decisions that changed history. So how do we get to learn more about them? That's what we're going to explore, and we're going to focus on how to use written records to recover their stories and rebuild their stories. I do want to begin with a caveat. Some of you may have come across great 19th century memoirs or town histories. Especially the second half of the 19th century was a great era in writing these town histories. Many of them are based on really vivid and much loved, but really undocumented oral tradition, what some people call grandmother stories. They're stories often that have evolved and morphed over the time, and they simply may not be trustworthy. You shouldn't dismiss them all outright. Some may have an important germ of truth, and others are the work of really careful 19th century local historians who actually used very excellent primary source documentation. Sometimes they used records that have since long been lost, and the only place that you can recover those records are in these 19th century history. But the general warning is, if you found a great story, a great grandmother story in a 19th century history, make sure that you check it out to corroborate it with archival evidence. So what kind of evidence then, if we can't rely just on these 19th century histories, what kind of evidence can we use? I like to call it accidental evidence, and that is the evidence that was generated by living and dying. This evidence can really be used in a way that allows us to gather clues from the past. We can get this evidence from living, dying, being born, getting married, paying taxes, owning land, attending town meetings, all sorts of activities of daily life. And a note on locating these sources, many more are becoming available online, which is really transforming research. It's a totally different world now than it was 30 years ago when I started doing it and spent most of my time going to archives and libraries. Now you can find much of this online, and it's as those sources are changing every day, I suggest that you start with familysearch.org wiki, which I note on my sheet. This will give you a background on where to look for in your particular town for the source of evidence. So you go to familysearch.org and you follow the prompts for searching, and you enter the name of your town, and it will give you a brief rundown. Well, actually, it's sometimes a very elaborate rundown of the various places you might be able to find evidence either online or in the physical archive. So what kind of clues can you gather to recover, and how can you use them? We're going to go over how you can find clues to rebuild the family and the household of the person or people that you're looking at, their house and home or possession and their possessions, their farm, their neighborhood, which was an important factor in their lives, their church, their military or militia preparation, town life and town involvement in imperial crisis, those 10 years leading up to, and then the time of the Revolutionary War, and then the wider world. And when you take all of this and layer it piece after piece after piece, you can build up a real sense of these people's lives and the context in which they lived. So let's get started on that. Families and households. So how can you reconstruct families and households? The first thing to remember is that the family was really the primary building block of life in the late colonial era. Everyone took his or her identity and purpose from their place and their function within a family. And colonial families tended to be large, they tend to be interconnected through marriage, and to create, as a result of those interconnections, kinship communities. But how can you recover the nuclear and then the broader family? Start with vital records, the evidence from life, being born, being baptized, getting married, dying. You may find these in church records, especially records of marriages, because ministers got paid for most weddings. You may find them in family Bibles. You may find them in your town clerk's records. But also, if you're from Massachusetts, mercifully, researchers long ago gathered together most of these and put them together in a published set of books for each town, vital records to 1850 or 1849, where these the data on births, marriages, and deaths are arranged that way. And you may find these books in your local history section of your town library. I know in the town libraries that I've gone to, the entire set of books has been available. But it's even easier than that if you're in Massachusetts, because several websites have taken the information in these books, sometimes supplemented with others, and created virtual and searchable archives of vital records data. So you have the URL for that in your handout that I gave you. So how do you go about doing that? I mean, this is really just common sense. Say that you're starting with someone like, we'll take, say, Jacob Lincoln here. So you begin with his date of birth and his parents, Jacob and Mary. And then you can go back and find out if his father was born in town and record that. You can go, you now know Jacob and Mary with his parents, so you can go to the marriages section and find Jacob and then Mary's last name so that you can research her family as well. So you have his parents and grandparents on both sides if you choose. And part of the ease in doing this is that these families tended, for the most part, to stay put, at least up to the middle of the 18th century, so that you can do this sort of building of research. Then you can come back after you have parents and grandparents and add siblings, all those in this list who shared the same parents. Then you go back to the marriages section, you find out if Jacob married and who he married, and then you can do the same sort of research for his wife's family, and then return to the birth section and find who Jacob and his wife gave birth to. And you've gradually built the whole nuclear family. And of course, you have to adjust it by checking the death section, because many children died young, so you won't include them in the nuclear family if they've passed away. But in this way, you've recreated the whole of the nuclear family of the person or people that you're attempting to study. And then you have to consider that family did not mean at this time just the nuclear family. Household might be a better way to think of it, although they refer to it as family. This household would be all those who live together. And that would, since at this time, everyone was expected to live within a family for means of proper discipline. Everyone was expected to live under, as they called it, under family government, with the father as the patriarch. So everyone living under one roof, not just nuclear kin, everyone living under the government of that patriarch would be considered family. So who else might be in your household, and how would you find out? First thing, if you go to tax assessments, and I'll tell you where to find them in your town, in your handout. If you check up here, the first category is polls rateable and polls not rateable. And polls are those people who could vote. And then if you check down in how many polls there are in that family, for this first family for here, for instance, Deacon Joseph Brown had 4 polls. Now, if you happen to know that at 1735, Deacon Joseph's sons were all under the age of 10, then you know that there are 3 other adult males and you need to go looking for them. This is a good place to start to see how many other people at a certain point in time were under the family. Who might they be? Well, they might be visiting kin, they might be apprentices, they might be boarders who are living in the house, they might be hired help. How would you find out? One place you can look, if it survives for your family, is in this second document I show here is an interleaved almanac. Now, almost all of the residents in our towns during this period were farmers who owned farms, and almost all of them relied on these inexpensive printed almanacs, which would tell the cycles of the moon and the, all sorts of patterns of daily life on one page. This page here is for December. And then people would sew in a separate page and keep notes on what happened that day, sometimes when they began planting or when they ended harvesting, but they also might include who came to help them, who was their live-in help, who came to visit, who was staying in their household, things like that. So you can seek in here for more records of who might be in your household at the time. Another place that you can look is in family account books, which I'll tell you more about later. But you'll look in there and find lists of people or mentions of people for whom who labored for the family. So they might be live-in hired help. Or if you look at town records, and I'll tell you later how to get there, they may make mention that the people in your family are caring for a certain poor or sick person at town expense, or that this family has taken in visitors from another town, part of the warning out process that you're probably familiar with. If not, I can tell you more in question and answers. But all of these people, as you find them, add them to your household. The average household had 10 or more people in it. And so you'll be checking all of these people, considering all of these people as part of the household, adding them all. So I mentioned tax assessments and town meeting records. You can find those through your town clerk. Almanacs and account books are going to be manuscripts, and finding them will be a bit hit or miss. Start with your local historical society or library, or look more broadly through archives like the Mass Historical Society or the American Antiquarian Society. Both of them have their catalogs online, and there are other historical societies that have online catalogs of their holdings. So now you've put together the nuclear family and the household. What about the house they're living in? And here, it's helpful to know where your family lived and what their house was like. It can be challenging. Some witness houses, as they're called, houses that were surviving during the Revolution, that were standing during the Revolution, do survive, but most do not. And you'll be very lucky if you come across in your historical society a labeled map, but you are more likely to find reference either in tax assessments to one of 4 tax districts. They're usually split up north, south, east, or west, and some towns have central districts as well. If you can locate them there, you know what section of town they're from. Or in town meeting records, they might discuss school districts, and you might be able to get a general sense of location from identifying the school district they're in. And then, of course, there are land records as well, deeds, which can help you place more precisely. Some historical societies collect land records. You can always go and do primary land record research through your county's deeds office, but this is really painstaking work. So unless you have a lot of time or you've been able to find land records locally, you may find that difficult to do. But placing your family in town is a helpful facet of coming to get a sense of who they are. But then what was their house like? And there really are a small number of options. Here are common house plans from a later book, but it's appropriate for our towns, Freedom's Way towns in the Revolutionary era. So it might be as simple as a one-room house with a loft above, as you see there in the top. More frequently in these towns at this period, which most of them in Freedom's Way will be in their second to third and some in their fourth generation of settlement. So these houses have been improved. Most of them will have at least 2 rooms, a hall and parlor construction, as you see in the second form there. The hall was the utilitarian area where they would cook and do home manufacture, and the parlor was the more public area. And then later they might add a second floor to that house. So you get 2 rooms above, and they always called them chambers. So hall and parlor with 2 chambers above. Then as these houses grew over time, they frequently added a shed roof in the back. And you'll see then this salt box type construction with the first floor kitchen in the back and 2-story construction in the front. And this is pretty classic. You'll come across a lot of these. And then finally, if it's a very well-to-do family, you might see, as there is in the bottom there, a Georgian mansion house, they might have called it at this point, which has 2 chimneys, 4 rooms on the first floor, and then if it's 2 stories tall, 4 rooms on the second story. And the 2 chimneys are a giveaway for that. Well, how do we find out what type of house our family owned? Useful evidence generated by dying. I always say we should be so grateful that people died as historians because they left us a font of info when they did. Wills are wonderful sources of information. They tell us how a decedent wanted his property or her property distributed. And not surprisingly, that tells us a lot about their property. And they frequently also allow us to document their possessions, room layout and use, farmlands, and even family relationships. Where are you going to find wills? It used to be that you had to go to the probate court archives, but for many towns, and Middlesex County is among the counties that does it this way, you can now find Middlesex County probates online through American Ancestors. It is a paid subscription. New England Genealogical and Historical Society is now called American Ancestors, and their website has probates for Middlesex County. It's searchable. More probates are coming online all the time, and they are such a valuable tool. I really urge you to seek them out. So how can we use them? Let's start with mapping out the rooms in your house through probates. Widows were entitled to use 1/3 of their former husband's or their deceased husband's estate while they were living. This was called widows' thirds. And so the house was literally divided by rooms among the heirs. And sometimes, in fact, the heirs might sell their portion of it, and the widow would be left with her room or 2 rooms in the original house, and a different family would move into the other house. But more frequently, it would just be that the inheriting offspring would then take over use of 2/3 of the rooms, and the widow would be left to hers. So here we have Kezia Loring, the widow of Deacon Jonathan Loring of Lexington. And he has specified which rooms, and this was common to specify which of the 1/3 of the house his widow would have. And you can see that he says she is to have the free use and improvement of his front room at the west end of his dwelling house, which can help us we can assume then, if he's specifying a front room, that there's also a back room. And if he's specifying an east end, that there's a west end, that there's an east end. Given the time period that this will is, I'm guessing that this is then a salt box house. A lot of these widows' thirds will also specify a room, say the room at the front end at the west end of their dwelling house and the chamber above. And then we know it's a 2-story house. Or it might specify right to use the stairway from the, excuse me. I know it's right to use the stairway from the kitchen to the upstairs. And then we have more information of the house, a right to pass from one set of rooms to another set, a right to pass through the kitchen to the barnyard. All of these are details that help us start sketching out the floor plan of the house. But my favorite part of probate research is the inventory. And the inventory, it's part of the probate process of dividing possessions after death. And it lists every single belonging of the decedent. And they would actually appoint 2 neighbors to come in and walk room by room and write down every item and its value. And I really mean every item. I've seen in inventories old rag and its value written down. Oftentimes these people would write down as they went through the rooms. Sometimes they would specify in the east room, in the west room, in the kitchen. And then we know exactly where they are and we can lay out what space they're talking about. But even if they don't lay out the rooms directly, you can usually tell it from the types of items that are in. And if you've been able to follow any of this writing, you can see that they start outside with the livestock and in the barn and in a storage room. And then they get down after that darker line. You can see tea kettle, salt box, frying pan, earthenware, and you know they're in the kitchen at this point. And think how wonderful this is that you now know exactly what the family owned, where they used it, and how they used it to a sense. And you can reconstruct the spaces in their house and how they lived in those spaces. So now you have the nuclear family, which you can place in their house with their household goods. What else can we use to know about the family? I return again to these tax assessments, and they'll be different in every town depending upon what survives. Tax assessments were done by the tax assessor every year. Many towns have 2 assessors who split into districts, or sometimes even 3 assessors or more, so that they don't have to cover the entire town. But where you find complete assessments for the town, you will find that you then have the name of every person in the town, how many Poles were in the household, and then either the value of their land, real estate, and the value of their personal estate, or the taxed amount on their land and the taxed amount on their personal estate. Now, all you need to do is order all of those by rank and locate your person within that rank. And you can now know how your family fit in the economic and social bracket of their town. And social bracket, of course, is very closely linked to the economic bracket. So it will be kind of critical for you to determine whether the people you're discussing or in researching are a wealthy squire or someone in his family, or a middling farmer, or a struggling, someone who's struggling with little land and few possessions. And that will be an important part of your story. And it's very easy to do with these tax assessments. It takes a little while to enter all your data, but it's a simple data entry problem. And most of these towns had a limited number of households, so it's not overwhelming. It's easily done. Okay, we have the family, we have the household, we have the house and the possessions. How about the farm? I know that you might be saying, the farm, what does this have to do with their story? Really, who cares? Why do we need to know about their farm? What difference does that make to their story? And I want to assure you, as someone who's a bit of a nerd about farm ecology and use at the time, the farm made all the difference. Everyone, either in these colonial and revolutionary towns in New England either had a farm or wanted to have one. The farm was their source of survival. It was the basis of their security, and it was the determinant of their social rank. So these aren't market farms like today. They're not producing a crop to sell and then buying what they need. These are family farms, and they're using the labor of the whole family, producing most of what the family needs to survive, the food and clothing, fuel, shelter, and this then becomes their security. It's critical to their security. It's critical to providing what they need to survive without being in debt. So owning a complete farm, sometimes called a messuage, you might see that term come up, that's key to personal independence and civic identity as a free man. They defined a free man as one who is not dependent on another. So you need a complete farm to be a free man. So did I just say a complete farm? I did. And what does that mean? So humor me for a moment on this sketch. I find this part really fascinating. And I tell you now, you won't need to remember all of what I'm about to tell you about a farm. Just listen. You'll just need the takeaway at the end. So a farm is not just a random selection of fields. New England colonial farmers knew a really specific calculus about the numbers of acres of different types of land that they had to own in order to support all the needs of an average family. And the answer simply is 60. 60 acres provided for most of their needs. And it also allowed them to keep their land fertile and sustainable. But it's not just any 60 acres. They had to have specific types of land. Here I want to show you, of course, there is no farm that was laid out exactly this way. This is just to help you understand the 60, how 60 breaks down. So they needed a house lot, which provided shelter for animals and people, and a dooryard vegetable gardens. This is where their house and their barn and their dung yard and their vegetable garden and their various working sites around the house would be. And they needed 2 acres for that. And then they needed orchard. And remember that apples were critical for cider, which was their main drink, not water. They did not drink the water. They didn't consider it safe, and it wasn't often. And they also needed the orchard for fruits, and they needed 2 acres for that. Then they needed tillage, and this is the critical piece of land. This is tilled or plowed land where you plant your grains that are going to feed your family. You need 6 acres of tillage to feed the average family of 10 people. But to keep this land fertile so that it'll keep producing year after year, you have to fertilize it. And so you need to fertilize the 6 acres. To fertilize the 6 acres, you need the manure of 6 cows, which of course will also provide dairy and meat. But then 6 cows have to eat. Cows need 15 acres of pasture to graze 3 seasons out of the year. But in the winter, they can't graze. They need to be fed hay that is harvested and put in the barn. And it takes about 15 acres of meadow to produce winter hay for 6 cows. And that meadow is usually, preferably down on the lowlands by rivers or streams called wet meadows. They flood in the spring, and that flooding will renew their nutrients. So the floods feed the meadow feeds and pasture feed the cows feed the tillage feeds the people, and it all stays sustainable. And then one last thing, of course, they need fuel, which they get from timber, and they have to harvest about an acre of their woodlot a year to supply their fuel. And it takes hardwoods 20 years to regrow, so 20 acres of wood will keep you perpetually in fuel. Now, they knew this calculus. It was part of their being. They knew exactly how much they would need in terms of acreage and types of land. You don't have to remember any of that. Just remember the family needs 60 acres of the right type: orchard, tillage, pasture, and meadow. They need 60 acres of land to survive. Well, how do we find out what our farmer owned? This ends up being incredibly easy in Massachusetts. About every 7 years, the province required every town to submit a valuation, which would list every head of household, how much land and what types they owned. So if you look at the top here, this one is Lexington in 1775. says polls, rateable. And then next one, you see houses and mills, and then bingo, orchard, mowing, pasture, tillage. You have everything you need right there. And you don't even have to go to these old manuscripts, because in 1771, when Massachusetts did the valuations, they were fairly complete. And a scholar about 30 years ago transcribed all of these and made it available in printed form, but even better, all that data has now been entered into an online free searchable database for which I provide the URL. So it's a snap. All you do is enter your family's name, and it will pop up with the amount of each type of land that they had. And the critical question then, did they have enough? Did they have what they needed to take care of themselves, or were they going to have to borrow and buy from other people? And would they need a supplemental craft to allow them to meet their needs? Or did they have excess land? Did they have excess goods, maybe excess hay, maybe excess pasture that they could trade to someone else for income? Did they have enough excess to give their sons farms, which was a critical thing? So you now can add from the land records. If you do land record research, you can add info from deeds and surveys and layer that all. But you now have information on their farm situation, their home, their family, and their household. You're getting a really good sense of the story. Then you add neighborhood. This is really key to broaden out. No man in this period is self-sufficient. No family is self-sufficient. They needed their neighbors for trading labor. They needed for trading goods, for sharing good times and hard times, for helping out, for providing what each lacked and what others had excess of. And remember that the families are in dense networks. So you tend to find that these neighborhoods are almost like broad cousinhoods, dense networks of neighborly mutual dependence on each other. How are you going to find information on that to support? If you can find it, a farm account book in your town can be priceless. This one's for John Parker. He's the captain of the militia, and he was also a farmer and a woodworker. So he had his farm, but he might at the time need certain periods extra labor. He might need something that was specially crafted, like something from a blacksmith. He might need something milled. How is he going to get this? He gets it from his neighbors, but there is little or no cash in these communities. So how do they pay for it? They pay for it by trading with their neighbors to redistribute resources around the neighborhood, and they keep record of that in these account books. They keep record of who owed them how much for what. A page for each neighbor that they traded with. In this case, it's John Parker's trading with Ensign Pierce. And you can see at the top of the page, he made a barrel for him. He provided him with 100 of nails. He provided Ensign Pierce with a coffin. He provided him with ox bows and a brake. And then after each neighbor has recorded everything for a period of time, usually about a year, they'll get together and they'll reckon. So if you look in 1746 in February, Ensign Pierce and John Parker got together. They compared what was due from John's book and what was due from Ensign Pierce's book. And they found that due to, it was 3 pounds, 2 shillings and 3 pence. Sorry, 3 pounds, 3 shillings and 2 shillings and 3 pence was due to Captain Parker from Ensign Pierce. No money exchanged hands. They just wrote down this new balance and went forward, and they can go forward for generations like this, balancing periodically with no money exchanging hands. Here you are able, through these account books, to build up a whole network of neighbors and to compare what each man owed each other. It really keeps everyone as debtors or creditors to their neighbors and binds them together. So this account book form of economy This will tell you who the closest neighbors were, what their relationships to the neighbors were, how interdependent they were, how much in debt they were to each other, and it will help you understand and think more broadly about the type of community that they had here. How else can you know neighbors? We mentioned the interleaved almanacs. They always recorded when a neighbor came to visit. That's a rich source to go to for finding out information about neighbors who came to either perform daily work, to visit, to live in for a while as hired labor, or who came by to do some trading, to watch with a sick person in your house. There are all sorts of reasons for neighbors to come, and they frequently did, and they're always recorded if you can find one of these interleaved almanacs. So now we have neighbors, we have farms, we have homes, and we have families. Of course, we have to consider church as another area that you can layer on your the story for your person. Colonial towns, we have to remember, were covenanted communities. Salvation depended on each other. You didn't get to heaven by yourself. And the church provided order, it provided discipline, and it also gives us a really clear sense of the social order in the town. Here I'm showing a common church record that you might come across, and that is a seating plan in the upper left there. You'll see that each box has an indication of who's to be seated in that, and it was periodically reseated by a committee who would consider, they called it seating the meeting house by dignity. So it was the wealthiest and the eldest would sit closest to the pulpit. So if you come across a seating plan like this, you know the social order of the entire town by considering the distance from the pulpit. Other records that you might find, church records, church had meetings just the way towns had meetings, and you might find discussions about discipline for fornication or unchristian behavior, lots of grist in there. And ministers' sermons, do take the time. If your minister's sermons are published or even if preserved in manuscript, read them for the period you're in. You will then be hearing exactly what was being preached from the pulpit during these revolutionary times. It will be critical for you to find out if your minister was a loyalist, and if he was, how and when he was turned out of his pulpit or confined to his farm or forced to flee. You can find these church records in church archives or historical society archives, or try the Congregational Library and Archives in Boston, which has put many of their records online. They've digitized them and made them available online. And we move towards the last categories here. There's military participation. Military research is not my forte, but unfortunately it was for a great many of antiquarians in the 19th century, and there are bountiful sources available. If you want to know if your person served in the Revolutionary War, check out published or online versions of, if you're from Massachusetts, Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors of the Revolutionary War. Another source, you can check and see if he or a dependent applied for a military pension. And you can also look and see, the military pensions you can find at the National Archive records in Waltham, but you can also now find them through online genealogical sites such as Ancestry. More and more is becoming available online for military pensions. And you might find in your town records either muster lists or payments to individuals for service in the militia. There's all sorts of evidence around there that's found, and much of it found without too much difficulty. So finally, the town. And here we have to pause to recognize the incredible power of the town to order and regulate daily life. Remember, the town's considered a corporate structure, a bodily structure, not a group of individuals. So town government then, as now, consisted of elected officials, selectmen, appointed committees, and town meetings. And town meeting records are so rich. If you go to town meeting today, you will notice that the structure of town meeting records 250 years ago was the same. There'll be warrant articles covering the election of officers, and then articles about taking care of schools or roads or the town's poor or the town's militia or tax abatements. Read these minutes for 10 years before the revolution, get familiar with the pattern of them, and eventually look to see who served in office, look to see who taught school, that's useful, who boarded poor people, who nursed the poor sick. Maybe someone contested a road or picked a fight with his neighbor. This is a rich trove of evidence to layer on church and neighborhood and farm and household and family. Your town meeting records will be available through your town clerk. In some towns, they're transcribed, and in some towns, they're transcribed and digitized. So do check to find the easiest way to get through your town meeting records. And I do want to stop to consider town meeting records as one of the richest sources of evidence of revolutionary history in your town, the story of your town. If you don't have a character or a story yet, start here. This is where you may see it pop out. From 1765 through the war, Boston town meeting and Boston committees appealed for input and support from the towns. So each town then met and discussed or debated these issues in town meeting, and they voted the sense of the meeting, and they communicated their decision or resolves back to Boston. Each town's reaction is going to be different based on the personalities in the town and the local conditions and religious sentiments and maybe even the physical location of the town. But here is your town's unique revolutionary story. Unfortunately, for lay people, it's not always easy to pick out that story. You have to get familiar with the forms of the records to know how to read them and what to look for. So if you get familiar with them, you'll notice the regular cycle of spring and fall meetings and the regular pattern of business. And then you'll start noticing these extra items, and you'll need to recognize them when they're being discussed. Sometimes they're discussed even obliquely or in slightly coded terms. So you'll need to get familiar with the history of these imperial crises and recognize when they're discussing it. So let me just go forward and say, I want to take one brief moment in this final slide to go quickly through a summary of the major imperial events. This is on the handout that I gave you as well. And a really excellent resource is to go to Mass Historical Society Coming of the Revolution page, and they will go through in much more detail each of these major crises to help you refresh your high school American history, because each of these will sound familiar in its own way. So in the fall of 1765, look for a Stamp Act response. In 1767, 1768, look for the Townshend Acts and responses. In June and July of 1768, look for responses to the Massachusetts Circular Letter. This is a fascinating one you may not remember from high school, but look for a discussion of being required to rescind their resolves, or mention of 92 non-rescinders, or things like that, and match it with the information that I give on the handout about what was happening here. It's a really interesting episode in your town history, and it's right there in your records. Then in 1768, there's an arrival of British troops, and you'll see references to a convention of towns or a speedy redress of grievances. 68 and 79, the non-consumption agreements. Look for specific language that I provide in my handout. The Boston Massacre in 1770, you are likely not to find mention in your town meeting records because most towns did not take a specific action in response to that. But in late 1772, early 1773, there's a Boston pamphlet and committees of communication established. Look for the stories in that, fill it out. In the winter of 1773 and 1774, there's the Tea Act, and what we call the Tea Party, but they always call the destruction of the tea. You will not find a mention of a tea party, but you might find act regarding the tea or the current crisis. And then in the fall of 1774, a fascinating, wonderful, well, for a nerd historian like me, very exciting period when the towns start getting ready for war at the direction of the provincial Congress. Everything they did here was illegal, but you'll see discussion about preparations for war, providing the militia with arms and ammunition, providing medical kits, providing town training for militia, redirecting crown tax monies, attending extra legal provincial assemblies, sending aid to Boston, which has been blocked off, or joining a colonial association. These are fascinating decisions, and they're made in your towns, and they're there in your town meeting records. And finally, in May and June, read for decisions on declaring independence. When the Congress sent their representatives home in May of 1776, they told them, find out whether your people will support revolution, independence, if we declare it. And most most colonies just asked the representatives. In Massachusetts, they asked every single town to weigh in on that. Look in your town meeting records for a discussion of whether the people in your town voted to support declaring independence. Of course, you can always add the wider world afterward. Newspapers are invaluable, and you can find them at American Antiquarian Society or online if you belong to the American ancestors in their database. So you put all of this together, newspaper information, town information, church, neighborhoods, farms, families, houses, homes, put it all together, and you reconstruct the world that they lived in and the actions that they took, and hopefully you recover some of their revolutionary mentality and the motivations that they had for taking these actions. Okay, I hope I didn't knock you over with all that information. I hope we can go to question and answers if there's anything needed there. Do you need me to stop sharing my? Yes, you do.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Mary. Wow, that really was a lot. I'm looking forward to diving into some of that research myself one of these days.
Okay.
So let's see. So as of right now, we don't have any questions in the Q&A box, but I invite all of the attendees to start adding them there. If it's easier for you to just write in the chat, you can do that as well. Or if someone's feeling bold and wants to raise their hand, we can call on you. No one else will see you, but you can then ask a question live to Mary. So we'll give you a couple of moments to think.
And I can also add that people can send questions afterwards if they want as well. I'm happy to field those if you provide an email address. And sometimes questions will come up only when you begin your research and you're realizing that you've hit a roadblock or that something's shown up that you don't understand. So that's fine too.
Okay. Let's see. All right, we have our first question. Alexandra asks, is there anything quick you can say about the, quote, approbation of retailers and inn holders?
Well, yes. It was required in the colonial period that inn holders and retailers, and particularly those that sold liquor, be approved by, I'm trying to think, I'm trying to remember which of the courts, it's the court of, whether it's common pleas or justice of the peace, I can't remember, but approved by one of the Massachusetts provincial authorities. And that was it was a requirement. And basically they were checking on whether you were an appropriate person to do this. And they were also trying to make sure that they had an appropriate number and not too many licenses issued in individual towns for that. But that does help you know if one of your people is being approbated for that. It does help you know if that person is an inn holder, which is a lot of information to get about a person and a lot for a story. And retailers as well. I won't go into detail on that, but Yes, retailers as well. Somebody who is selling something, but stores in the way we think of them now were not as common, particularly in the countryside. So it might be a particular type of retailer.
Thanks, Mary. There is a follow-up question to that, that you may have just alluded to it, but just to confirm. So can one assume that a retailer is always selling liquor?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so a retailer could sell numerous things. Liquor may be one of them.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure, and I will follow up and research that to make sure, but I don't believe it's restricted just to liquor. There may be other things that they could be retailing as well. Generally, they are most concerned about liquor, yes, but I don't believe it's limited just to liquor, but I can follow up on that.
Great. Okay, keep those questions coming.
When I was doing research, back when you used to have to go to the Mass Archives to do this sort of research, and I was focusing at that point on the town of Lexington, and I remember going through all the mentions, all the times in which Lexington came up in the Court of Common Pleas and just sessions of the peace. And most frequently it was for approbation of inn holders and retailers, that the most frequent mention of a town would be for an individual applying to be approbated.
Okay, here's another question from Alexandra. If a widow was approbated shortly after the death of her husband, would
Mhm.
she eventually have been limited to owning a third of the business?
Well, that would depend on the terms of the will if one was left. The widow's thirds were the rule that was followed usually and always in the case where someone died intestate, so without a will. But the husband could write the will in any way he wanted. He didn't have to say just a third. He could say more if he wanted. But when a widow is approbated shortly after her husband's death, it usually means that she and he were involved in keeping an inn or a public house of some sort, and that it is her way of supporting herself, and that she's continuing his practice. And that was looked upon with favor for particularly because they didn't want widows to become poor charges on the town. So if she had a way to support herself, they were generally favorable towards that.
All right, we have Ann Forbes, who has raised her hand and would like to ask you something live. So
okay, and Forbes is someone I should be asking questions of. She's highly knowledgeable.
Okay, Ann, you're on.
If you can hear me, I just saw that the chat was disabled, but I see question and answer.
Oh, okay, interesting. I'll look into that, but do you have another question, Ann?
Not right now.
Okay.
Okay.
Huh. All right. So it seems like the Q&A box would be the best place to use the Q&A, add a question. I'm not sure what's going on with the chat because it looks like it's live to me. All right.
Does anyone have a particular person or family that they are researching that they've had difficulty sort of fleshing out?
You could feel free to type that into the Q&A as well. Okay, we've got somebody. It's Alexandra. So Alexandra, would you like to share the family's name or any more information, or would you like to speak live to Mary? You can raise your hand if that's what you'd like to do. Okay, live might be best. So let's see. Oh, it says that you're using an older version of Zoom. So I can promote you to a panelist, I guess. We're always learning new technology here. So here's Alexandra. Oh, can you unmute yourself?
I can. Hi. Yeah, so I'm as part of the Lexeer project, I'm trying to find any kind of source whatsoever for an African American or a woman of African descent. We're not sure have much African descent, named Phoebe Bannister. And she allegedly was from Concord. There are no vital records for Bannisters between the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 19th century. So that's a complete dead end. But aside from her specifics, there's another set of people who end up in Concord, people of African descent who end up in Concord at around the same time. And I'm wondering if there's any known thing that Africans they weren't free men. Well, the one of them was actually ended up, he was underage, so he became the ward of a guardian in Concord. But anyway, I'm just curious if there are any other sources for people who are not landowners and don't have the vote and don't have aren't going to show up in town meeting because unless they've been warned away from the town.
Right. So this is a great point, and probably one that I should have raised. Researching people who are not white male landowners is challenging because they don't leave them as much of a record, and in some cases they leave a very fine, very light mark on the record. And researching African Americans is particularly challenging. There have been some special studies done, though. Did you say that the person, Phoebe Bannister, is from Lexington or Concord?
So she married someone in Lexington, and her marriage record says she's from Concord.
Okay, and what's the time period?
They married in 1754.
Okay, 70. Oh, right before. Too bad. I have been through the records of the Reverend Jonas Clark in Lexington, and he records the names of every African American couple that he marries. But unfortunately, he comes in 1755, so that doesn't help you. But where else can you look? So it's really hard. Are you familiar with the references on that trace the African American participants on April 19th? Because some of those go into there are family stories connected with that.
Okay. Yep.
Let's see, where else can I send you? There's a slave, a census, but that's not going to be appropriate for your time, and it doesn't name individuals.
Well, it's 1755, but it's only statistics as far as It
is. Yeah, it's only statistics. If she stays in Lexington, I would suggest that you go to, and this will involve a little bit of time, but I would suggest that you go to the Lexington Historical Society and look. I did a couple of studies, and so did someone else. It should be in the records there. But there's also the church records of Jonas Clark, and not the church records, they are there, but the interleaved almanac of Jonas Clark. And that almanac is very rich in his details of baptizing, and he mentions a numerous African-American children that he baptized in the church records, but he also mentions African-Americans that he married in the interleaved almanac. They're usually people who have worked for him or in his family. Prince Chester and Lucy, I forget her last name, but you'll see those there. He does record
Jonas Clark.
Jonas Clark.
Okay, because that's so her son and her husband were baptized the following year after the marriage, but I haven't found any record of her joining the church or leaving the Concord church or
So it would be,
baptism. So it would be that's a really interesting.
one direction.
Yeah.
And if she stays if she stayed in Lexington, do look into the studies. There are 2 or 3 studies that name every African American that we could possibly identify. And as I mentioned before, these people, if they were not landowners, and it's unlikely that they were, they lived in somebody else's family. So
so her husband did own land, but we don't know where she came from in Concord, and so that's the mystery. That's the real.
And in Concord, you probably have already used Elise Lemire's book, Black Walden. It's called Black Walden.
Okay. Yep. That's on my list.
A lot of information about. And then the other person, it's so wonderfully generous. Contact Bob Gross. If they lived in Concord and there's any information about them, he will know.
Okay. And his last name is spelled how?
Gross, Gross. He lives in Concord now, but he wrote The Minutemen in His World, and he just wrote Transcendentalists in Their World.
Okay.
Great. And we do have the final webinar in this series will be with the Atlantic Black Box Project.
Oh,
and we'll
great.
also be focused just on researching the stories of free and enslaved African Americans during the time period. So Mary, everything you said was very helpful, and we hope that we can dig in even deeper in a couple of weeks.
You will. And the specialists really do know how to get about that.
Yeah, it's probably more appropriate for that session, but was manumission completely a private affair, or was that registered somewhere? Like if someone was received his or her freedom, was that just a piece of paper they carried around, or
yeah, I'm not sure what if there was a legal requirement. Certainly they would know in the session that's coming up, the 3rd session, they would know.
Okay.
Right.
We do have 2 other questions that I'd like to get in here. So thank you so much, Alexandra. And so Ann Forbes does have a question. All right, Mary. What guidance do you have on the use of junior or the lack of thereof in family research? It seems like in her case, junior's only appearing occasionally. So this is in regards to the Jones Tavern and Wright Tavern in Concord. There seems to be confusion between 2 generations of Captain Ephraim Joneses. And at one point, an older Ephraim Jones whose lives overlapped.
Yeah, can be really tricky in family research. In general, as a practical matter, I've found that junior tends to be applied when both father and son are still living, and dropped once the father has passed away. And I've even come across cases where the third becomes the junior once the grandfather passes away. And as I'm sure you know, with these families and the reuse of names, it can be so confusing to distinguish between generations, particularly if they stayed on the same farm, or kept the same inn, or engaged in the same faculty, they call it the same handcraft. In the Parker family, there are generations of John Parkers, and they're hard to distinguish as well. I don't have much guidance other than the between living and having passed away.
Okay, I'm just going to double check with Anne, seeing as your hand has been raised. Is there something else you'd like to say, Anne, as a follow-up?
I'm sending this now, just for Alexandra, the Concord connection on African Americans of that era, the Robbins House.
Oh yes.
Has done what research we could on that era. And in fact, Bob Gross's graduate student, John Hannigan, who is now curator over at Mass Archives, did a lot of the groundwork specifically for us on that question. So you could contact me with your question. Desiree, are you giving out email addresses?
We can find a way to connect you for sure. Yes.
Okay,
Thank you, Anne, for adding that.
Thanks, Sam. Great
Okay.
point.
Okay, and we have a question from Sydney Blackwell. Hi, Sydney. She asks, in looking for references to Native Americans in the 1700s, what are the best terms to look for? Do you know if tribal names were being used and referenced at that point?
I don't know. This is another very specialized area. No, I don't know if tribal names were being used. I would tend to doubt it because did you say, was she looking for the 1700s? By the 1700s, most of the local tribes had been reduced to such they were still present, of course, but reduced in such a number that they weren't discussed as tribal presences, but more as individual Indians, and they were called Indians frequently then. So I see much more discussion about an individual Indian or a squaw, terrible terminology, but that's what they would use at the time. And very little discussion about tribal presence. Trying to think, no, that's later. That would be outside this period. Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, that's again, Native people, African Americans, just a harder, much harder search. The common records that we use for discussing regular people, the records generated by living and dying, not going to be a great source in many cases for African Americans and Native Americans.
Okay, so we do have time for maybe another question or two. So please get those in now, or again, feel free to raise your hand. I do believe the chat now is actually functioning, again, if that works best for you. Otherwise, we'll look to conclude here shortly.
And I do want to just put in one more pitch for your town meeting records, spending the time on them. I know, especially if they haven't been transcribed and you have to go and sit with the originals, you may think, oh, this is not worth it. But you very quickly get used to the style of writing. You very quickly begin to recognize the regular pattern of normal warrant articles, and then the others will stand out. And it is fascinating history to see what your town, what the people in your town actually did and said, and especially in May and June of 1776, when John Adams asks every town to weigh in on whether or not they would support independence. Some of these towns, some of them just responded, took a vote and responded by saying, yes, we would support independence. Some of them wrote complete declarations of independence. Malden, we did a program with Malden. They wrote a complete, which laid out their understanding of their rights, what rights have been violated, how they should respond to that, their theological bases. I mean, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful document. And to think of the people in your town sitting down together, having these discussions and then recording it, it's such rich history. It's really worth the time it takes to dive into it, to recover those stories.
Absolutely. And Mary, you yourself had directed me to read town records.
Did I?
A number of years back. And so I can second that it is fascinating. So we do have one more question in the chat here. Are women's schools the same as dame schools?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they are. Some people like to make the distinction that dame schools are for very small children and women's schools are for girls. I haven't actually seen that borne out in the records. When I've been working with town meeting records, they seem to interchangeably talk about, it's usually in terms of payment for a particular person for keeping a dame school or a woman's school. And I have not been able to say in that research that they are different schools. So it's an interesting idea, but I haven't found conclusive evidence that it's true. Although I could be persuaded if I ever came across a town meeting record that referred to first a dame and then a woman's school as different things. So good question. And great that you came across that inevitably came out of town meeting records. And it's just another indication of how valuable they are. Okay, well, Mary, I think that's it. So I'm going to
wrap us up here. So on behalf of Freedom's Way National Heritage Area, I'd like to thank Mary for sharing her knowledge and expertise with us today. Mary, you are a wealth of information, and we're so fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from you. And thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today. We invite and encourage you to reach out to us at any time to share your thoughts, your wants, your needs as they relate to the Revolutionary Stories Initiative. We strive to ensure that our partners have access to the resources they need to take on this fascinating work and are always looking for feedback on how we may adapt to better serve you. As mentioned, we'll send an email next week with a link to view the recording of today's webinar, as well as the handouts that Mary referred to her in her presentation, in case you did not receive that email or it's in your spam from this morning. One final reminder, if you haven't done so already, please consider registering for the next two webinars. Next week on Thursday, the 27th at 2 p.m., the Lex Seher group will be presenting on researching the stories of women in the heritage area. Again, a special focus on the Revolutionary War period. And then the following week, Thursday, November 3rd at 2 p.m., the Atlantic Black Box Project will be joining us to share techniques for researching the stories of free and enslaved African Americans in the heritage area, specifically focused on the Revolutionary War period. So with that, please enjoy the rest of your this beautiful afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.